Thanks very much, Walter. And good to see everybody to reflect with me on Camus and the pandemic and the plague. Early in 2020, the plague, which had been published by Camus over 70 years earlier, was being talked about and read everywhere. I doubt if there's a person here who didn't run into some reference to it. 2 years later, in the words of one editor, no one's really talking about Camus anymore. Of course, fashions come and go. And the faster, given the instantaneous media we live by. But the rise and fall of the plague makes for a fascinating story within the pandemic story about why we outgrew it and how conflicted we're all in this together became. Some dates will help to refresh your memory. March 10th, 2020, the first coronavirus cases in Michigan. March 18th, the first death. March 24th, Governor Whitmer's stay-at-home order. March 31st, Michigan was third in US deaths with 259. April 17th, President Trump tweets, "Liberate Michigan," to armed demonstrators who invade the state capitol to protest the shutdown. Today, over 30,000 Michigan deaths, compared with about the same number in Canada, which has 4 times the population. 900,000 dead in the United States, over 600,000 more than if we had the same death rate as Canada. A few dates show the attention given to Camus' plague story. March 19th, New York Times. This is 2020 again. Op-ed, Camus on the coronavirus. March 28th, The Guardian. An article about the remarkable phenomenon of the plague being read around the world, including heightened sales, bestseller at that time in Italy, and new edition. New English translation just appeared in November. Throughout March and April of 2020, stories in many mainstream publications, including the TLS, the New York Review of Books, the London Review, Harper's, the New Yorker. And then strikingly, on May 15th, the New York Times republishes Stephen Spender's 1948 review, 72 years later. This list is only the beginning. Over 10,000 articles have now been published. Over 1,000 articles have now been published in India, Morocco, Poland, the Philippines, hundreds of places and languages by journalists, Camus specialists, philosophers, scholars from every conceivable discipline, bloggers, even cartoonists. I'm aware of 2 collections of essays about to be published. Most striking, perhaps, has been the attention given it to by medical practitioners. My own retinologist, Gary Abrams, who's on this call, enthusiastically talked to me about it during our last appointment, and he texted to me a passage about the public's denial of pandemics from the book's beginning that a colleague had sent to him. The phenomenon of the plague in our consciousness in 2020 also gives us a lesson in the sociology and economics of culture. Key terms I would use would be interest and opportunity. I'm talking about the obviously financial interest of media and the career opportunity offered to writers and scholars, whether it's the online Vox or the New York Times or Philosophy Today or the London Review or the TLS, the media are catering to their audience's interest. In other words, a given book is mentioned as relevant to people's lives, which then serves the media's interest in surviving and flourishing. So once it became clear that there was an audience for the plague, because it was relevant to what people were experiencing, every major publication had to have an article about it. And every Camus scholar and author with familiarity and publishing record was impelled to write something about the plague and the coronavirus, which becomes a common title or subtitle of articles, including one by myself in Tikkun. These hundreds of articles were written all around the world as the novel was being mined for what it had to teach, obviously, about living in and coping with the pandemic, including such topics as functioning amidst the absurdity of a disease that appeared for seemingly no reason at all, the similarities and differences between his plague and ours, living and working within the paralyzing existential fear imposed by the pandemic, retaining hope amidst catastrophe, and the solidarity among members of the sanitary squads. In the face of absurdity and mass death, many writers extolled the modest and self-limiting philosophy behind the plague, rooted in the myth of Sisyphus and further developed in the rebel. Namely, one must act with others wherever one happens to be, often by simply doing one's job. The plague tells of how people lived in a fictional bubonic plague in a mid-sized coastal city in North Africa in the 1940s. At the beginning, rats leave the sewers and start dying here and there, and then die en masse over several days. Their fleas apparently now attacking human beings, first here and there, and then en masse. Without adequate vaccine or medication, tens of thousands of people will die over a year and a half. And then, just as mysteriously as it began, the pestilence wanes and leaves. The story moves from the authorities' denial of what is happening at the beginning of the total lockdown of the city, which shuts it off from the rest of the world. The novel goes on to tell of the people's sense of panic, many living a sense of separation and, a word Camus loves to use, exile from loved ones elsewhere. Preoccupation with the numbers reporting regularly how many people have fallen to the disease, and the many ways lives become dominated by the plague. Sounds familiar, right? The novel focuses at length on two main responses: of militant Jesuit priest Father Paneloux, and of the associates of Dr. Bernard Rieu, who form a public health team to battle the plague as best they can. Paneloux gives two dramatic sermons, the first at the beginning of the collective ordeal that blames the townspeople for their lack of religious faith. The second, affirming the incomprehensible desolation as the will of a mysterious God that we must embrace. In between, Paneloux joins the team created by Rieu, former political militant Jean Tarou, and devoted civil servant Joseph Grand. Another, Dr. Castel, is preoccupied with creating an effective treatment. The team tries to inoculate people against the plague, create sanitary spaces, quarantine the infected, care for them in makeshift hospitals, and keep careful track of the course of their illnesses. Also in the circle are Rambert, a journalist from Paris, who spends most of the novel trying to escape Iran. And then when the opportunity finally presents itself, throws in his lot with the townspeople and joins the team. Paneloux does likewise briefly, but becomes infected and dies, as does Tarou at the end. Also connected with the team, but refusing to participate with them, is Cotard, a criminal who tries to hang himself at the beginning of the novel, but then celebrates the epidemic because it gives him cover for his smuggling business and pauses the police search for him. Characteristic of Camus, this is an all-male story, or almost. Rieu's wife is ill at the beginning and goes off to a sanatorium before the plague strikes, where she dies in the course of the novel. She's replaced as the doctor's essential helpmeet by the steady, silent presence of his mother. Another absent female is Rambert's mate. Hold on, I seem to have lost my camera. Another absent female presence is Rambert's mate, waiting for him in Paris, who finally joins him in Iran at the novel's end when travel resumes. Completely absent are the 70,000 or so Arabs of Iran who received exactly a single mention in the story as the journalistic of Rambert before the pandemic shelves his project. I'm going to return to that issue in a moment. Question, though, interesting for so many of us in 2020 is, in what ways does the novel parallel our own experience? Certainly, the plague resembles most of our period of shutdown, periods of shutdown. No travel, no physical contact with loved ones, a common experience of separation from the outside world. This is an exile which continues for many today, captured in the novel by the image of the closed and guarded city gates. And increasingly for us, it brings requirements and surveillance. Both plagues in Iran and among ourselves impose not just rules and prohibitions, but an overall sense of a stifled existence. But even as things lighten up, I would suggest for many of us, the sense of stifled existence is still hanging over us. We, like the people of Iran, experience a powerful sense of unfreedom, tallied daily now among ourselves as well by infection and death statistics, controlled by mandates as we wait wearily for the pestilence to end. It's punctuated by demonstrations such as the armed crowd at Michigan's Capitol 2 years ago, and Iran's protesters demanding bread or fresh air. There, like here, public health teams do battle with the plague. Our doctors, nurses, other hospital workers have been plugging away in near desperate circumstances day after day, in which, as one doctor wrote early in our pandemic in the journal Clinical and Infectious Diseases, the relentless determination and compassion of nurses, intensivists, respiratory therapists, and other healthcare workers is only countered by the loneliness of patients without their loved ones at their side. Writing about the parallel between Camus' fiction and today's reality, this doctor stresses that he and his colleagues see themselves and their situation in ways similar to the novel. At the beginning of our pandemic, like in the novel, and during the Omicron phase, a common experience and expectation was that COVID-19 might strike anyone randomly. And so nothing can save Father Panelou or Taru, and nothing but good fortune seems to differentiate them from survivors, Ryu and Grant. The plague striking its victims as a bolt out of the blue, that's the story in the plague, in the book, remains characteristic throughout the novel. And the entire novel, therefore, is underpinned by a sense of terror. We may remember that sense of terror ourselves, especially in the first months of 2020. In March of that year, the New York Times ran philosopher Alain de Botton's article about the Camusian absurdity of the pandemic. According to this author, Camus was, I'm quoting him, drawn to his theme because he believed that the actual historical incidents we called plagues are merely concentrations of a universal precondition, dramatic instances of a perpetual rule that all human beings are vulnerable to being randomly exterminated at any time by a virus, an accident of the actions of our actions of our fellow man. In other words, he's saying, quoting again, suffering is randomly distributed. It makes no sense. It is simply absurd. And that is the kindest thing one can say of it. Botton was not alone. Early in the pandemic, as the doctor writing in Clinical and Infectious Diseases said, Camus reminds us that we can never be mentally or fully prepared for pandemics. The gifts of the Enlightenment and the advances of civilization are pointless when a pandemic removes the safety bumpers of our lives. Suffering becomes randomly distributed, causing everyone to aspire escaping the fates of an unfortunate destiny. Same theme motivates an article by psychotherapist Patty Farr in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. At the moment, he writes, we are all Dr. Ryu. He focuses on our futility and dread in the face of death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness, themes drawn from Yalom psychotherapy, and then he turns to treatment uses of Camus' thought today. Like Platon, Farr insists on seeing the plague through the stranger and the myth of Sisyphus. There are themes of randomness and absurdity. It's a fine discussion shaped by the author's urgent current interest. But if our pandemic teaches anything, it's not that our risks are random and life is absurd. When at the beginning of the pandemic, we were told to stay home and to practice social distancing, we were learning how the disease spread and that we were all its potential victims and carriers, as well as relearning the underlying social and economic fact that despite profound inequalities, our very survival depends on each other. The non-random logic of the disease, from its origin to its transmission, to keeping it at bay by 2021. Remember, President Biden was calling COVID-19 a disease of the unvaccinated, is one of our main learnings and a decisive difference between Camus' story and ours. We've been slowly educated in public health, learning a great deal about how the disease travels, who gets it, and why. We've learned that Platon's absurdist reading of the situation is radically false. The way that suffering is distributed does make sense, is not at all absurd. As we've lived it, it's demanded medical science, public health, and more today, environmental politics. Camus' description of Iran's public health team and their practice takes us in a far different direction than the ideology of randomism and absurdism. And now I call it an ideology because of its role in covering over social differences of vulnerability. In fact, it suggests an important social dimension. This is evoked in one of the novel's great moments towards the end of the book when Ryu and Taru swim together in the sea. Describing not the struggle, but their moment of release is one of the high points in all of Camus' writing. Coming back to shore, when they caught sight of the plague watchman, and this is now from the novel directly, Ryu guessed that his friend, like himself, was thinking that the disease had given them a respite, and this was good. But now they must set their shoulders to the wheel again. Neither spoke a word, which was precisely the point. This was a communion of combatants who had no need to say how much they shared. Their silence captured Camus' sense of commitment. Today, it suggests the solidarity among millions of essential and public health workers and between them and ourselves. The point is that by the plague, Camus had moved on from his early single-minded stress on absurdity. As he said by the early 1950s, and I'm quoting him, if there is an evolution from the stranger to the plague, it has gone in the direction of solidarity and participation. End of quote. The novel's main point is not that the universe is random or meaningless. That was Camus before his immersion in resistance. To be sure, that randomness recurs in the framing fact that the plague does seem to come and leave for no clear reason and does seem to strike its victims at random, which gives Father Panelou the opportunity to find a religious logic in his sermons by first blaming the victims for their lack of faith and then attributing the plague to God's mysterious will. More relevant is what Camus later called the novel's, quoting him again, obvious content, the struggle of the European resistance movements against Nazism, end of quote. The core action of the novel is centered on the public health team formed early on in the pandemic, early on in the plague by Dr. Ryu and his associates. And of course, their teamwork in the face of the plague, which means, as another recent commentator, Sean Illing, wrote in Vox about the lesson to be drawn from the novel today, saying, "This is a time for solidarity." In addition to Illing, the responses I find most striking are those expressing exactly this mood by doctors and hospital workers who stress their role as healthcare workers. One of them rejects the fad for being called heroes and instead thinks of Dr. Ryu as he visits patients, doing a, quote, job I have trained for and needs doing. And he notes that Camus, quote, links all plague physicians through the ages and into the future. I like to think of myself as part of that legion. Another doctor testifies that in many years of rereading and rereading the plague while teaching medical humanities classes, I often considered whether in a time of plague I would have followed in the footsteps of Dr. Ryu, or whether, like Rambert, would have sought to escape. With his quote unquote decision to keep working in the hospital rather than retire, I followed in the footsteps of Dr. Ryu, feeling that it was required of all of us physicians and human beings is to do our job and to continue to care for our patients, regardless of the circumstances. Camus protested in the 1950s against Roland Barthes' criticism of the plague as an alleged story of the resistance that replaced, in Barthes' words, a struggle against men by a struggle against the impersonal microbes of plague. In other words, there's no person-to-person human struggle in the novel. It's all a struggle against the disease. After making the connection with the resistance, Camus answers, insisting that the novel does beyond any possible discussion. Camus used to think that there was no possible discussion, arguing against him, represent the transition from an attitude of solitary revolt to the recognition of a community whose struggles must be shared. For an understanding of how this seemingly non-political novel could be intended and read as deeply political at the time, 1947, right after the war, we need only turn to Jean-Paul Sartre's Columbia University lecture in June 1945, half of which was devoted to his then good friend's unpublished novel. This is Sartre now. The doctor rebels against illness, against death, against the world. The rebellion doesn't lose itself in useless and sublime condemnations of heaven. It consists simply in occupying itself with those who are suffering. It cares for them without hope, without help, without medicines, because everything's exhausted. But he continues to visit them and cares for them with the remaining means available to him. And thus, in doing his job simply and without illusions, he defies evil and the universe. It is this belief in austere, modest, and useful action that distinguishes Camus from the older generation of writers like André Malraux. End of Sartre quotation. This sentiment was widely shared at the time, so much so that Camus' name was mentioned for the Nobel Prize for Literature, although at the time he was only in his early 30s. Right after the war, the broad message of austere, modest, and useful action resonated widely. Sartre, for one, had written about France under the German occupation as a republic of silence. Camus' insistence that the allegory of the resistance was one of the book's main strands, as well as both men's immediate post-war reflections, sound very much like, what does it remind us of? We're all in this together, which became so familiar to us in 2020. At the time, it seemed obvious enough to say one must act with others wherever one happens to be, even if simply doing one's job slowly, patiently, undramatic. We're talking about workers who are essential, and we're essential for survival and health. As Ryu says, there's no question of heroism in all this. It's a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile, but the only means of fighting plague is common decency. All in it together. As the story goes on, Camus says the plague had, this is 2/3 of the way through the novel, the plague had swallowed up everything and everyone. No longer were there individual destinies, only a collective destiny made up of plague and the emotions shared by all. Strongest of these emotions was the sense of exile and deprivation, with all the cross currents of revolt and fear set up by these. In later arguing with Bach, Camus talks about Rambert, the journalist, quote unquote, giving up private life in order to take his place in the common struggle. As Rambert himself concluded towards the end of the novel, this business is everybody's business, all in it together. But as Roland Barthes' 1950s criticism of the plague indicated, the theme of solidarity, this is 6-7 years after the end of the war, that theme of solidarity didn't wear very well. So much so that Francis Janson, colleague of once approving Sartre, attacked Camus in 1952 in L'État Moderne, Sartre's journal, among other reasons for Camus' Red Cross morality. And then much later, by 1970, his now former friend Sartre excuse me, problem here. Well, I can continue. By 1970, former friend of Camus, Sartre, attacks Camus for saying the German invasion was like the plague. Quel con, Sartre remarked. What a jerk, what a fool, or worse. The underlying reason for Sartre's hostility wasn't the novel itself, but the Cold War and the fact that the two had become, were no longer friends. The friendship had broken apart. They took diametrically opposed positions towards communism, and their important friendship violently fell apart. The plague's interest for us in 2020 was fated to be short-lived. For another historical reason, not simply the reasons of 1950s, the Cold War, but the plague's interest for us was fated to be short-lived for a different historical reason, our own. Our public health situation immediately became political. Political for multiple reasons. Above, I gave one key date, April 17th, 2020. Liberate Michigan. Polls show that the part of the population describing themselves as Republicans had gone along with the shutdown until then, reluctantly, but yes. Their opposition began to grow to the very idea that this was a real pandemic and that needed to be contained by public health measures, stoked by President Trump. Second, despite the hopeful sense of solidarity voiced in "we're all in it together," profound class and racial differences appeared very early on. We know, for example, that the African-American death rate doubled and tripled the death rate among white Americans. Workers went on wildcat strikes demanding safety. The stress of unemployment and poverty began to hit hard, especially among those least able to afford it. And the government took action to help some people, but at the same time created slush funds for the largest corporations. Many people lost jobs or were laid off, worried about finances, were forced into homeschooling in cramped houses, waited in line at food banks, or were forced to go to workplaces, often on public transportation that might be swarming with the virus. Among our essential workers were a large number of immigrants and Black and brown Americans, and because they lived and worked in close quarters and had little access to protection, they were far more likely to come down with COVID-19. America's several 100,000 excess deaths compared to, say, Canada have resulted from deliberate personal and political choices and are as systemic as is our racism. Just as at the same time, the world's wealthiest among us saw their worth double in these 2 years. It was no accident that the George Floyd demonstrations happened in the middle of our pandemic, which momentarily put systemic racism on the agenda and took place through the social and political madness of Trumpism. Camus' protagonists were doing battle only against nature afflicting humans. But in our real world, here and now, Americans have been heading towards what many commentators now regard as a civil war. However it felt at the beginning of the pandemic, by 2022, we are worlds away from Camus' relatively simple story. And no wonder the novel scarcely gets mentioned anymore. We might ask, what might have preserved its continuing relevancy for us? One answer is given by scholars from Morocco and Denmark, Ahmed Kabel and Robert Philipson, spelling out not what Camus teaches in The Plague, but the many ways in which the book falls short. Above all, ignoring the realities of colonial violence and domination in the real historical city of Oran, Algeria, in 1947. This would begin with the 35 or 40% of Arabs in the actual city in the 1940s. That city being the one European majority city in an overwhelmingly Arab Algeria, which is barely noticed by Camus in this, his second great novel about French Algeria. The 70,000 or so Arabs of Iran, as I mentioned, receive exactly a single mention in the story before the plague forces Rambert to shelve his journalistic project. Gabel and Philipson focus on all the things Camus might have said in the novel, but for the fact that his, they say, universal humanism hides colonialist politics. Their argument, what is needed is reflective analysis that has to aim at major societal change, at decolonization that ends systemic abandon and racist structural violence. Camus' book fails to assist this, they say. To these ears, Camus' message of solidarity would no doubt sound very much like the limits of "we're all in this together." Limits that began to appear among us very sharply as our pandemic wore on. As its situation, our situation increasingly demanded everyone's participation. For public health reasons, as if for no others, our society has been tearing itself apart from the fury of those who refuse to be included on any terms but their own. As we just saw at the Ambassador Bridge, even in Canada, their freedom refuses any terms but their own. Just as All in It Together suggests a different possible history over the past 2 years, a path many Americans wanted to take, but that didn't win out. Cabell and Philipson are proposing a different novel and a different Camus. Just as Kamel Daoud has retold The Stranger from the point of view of the murdered Arab, so are they imagining a different version of the plague from a point of view that includes the missing inhabitants of Iran. Camus' Invisible Arabs testify to the limits of his famous sense of solidarity. Solidarity among us, forgetting the others. In reality, he himself could only write about his white European Algeria, whose ultimate irony and tragedy is that it ceased to exist shortly after he died. Our plague, real and not fictional, has taken place in a very different social and historical situation. We've only been briefly able to imagine our solidarity of all being in it together. and have no idea among ourselves of how this will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
It's time for questions.
I see a couple of hands. Jacqueline? I think
So
Geoff's hands were up first. Yes.
I believe those were just
Or that's
applause.
just cheers.
Applause. Yes. If you would like to make a comment or question, click the reaction button and click raise your hand so that I can see you and I can unmute. Or you can put your comments or questions in the chat as well.
Oh, the chat is...
All right.
I see Mike Scrivener. Yes.
Yeah. Ron, I really enjoyed that. That was really nuanced and complex and really spoke to me.
Thank you.
In terms of Camus' insights and his limitations, I wonder if it's a way for us to think about our own sense of certainty and the things that we're blind to right now. And particularly, I mean, you alluded to, Civil War, people talking about that. And I do believe that in the Trump era, the way things have gone, that even people, not even, but people on our side, I'm just making that assumption, that people on our side don't always help matters in terms of, the other side. And one thing that occurred to me, and I'm sure you can think of others, was there's this horrible right-wing congresswoman, what's her name? I forget her name, but she got
Green
mixed
or
up.
Bobert?
Which one?
Green or Bobert?
Well, there's a lot of them. It's somebody else. Oh, Green, Marjorie, something Green. But anyway, she got mixed up with soup, gazpacho soup, and Gestapo. And of course, on our side, it was, Yuck City. I mean, we were really going for it. But I'm thinking that's a real class thing. My parents had no idea what gazpacho soup was. I think that in working class culture, by and large, there's a set of assumptions about what's the norm, and there's this in more educated environment, there's another set. And I thought that was cruel. I mean, not that this woman doesn't deserve condemnation, but I thought that was superficial, unthoughtful, and not helpful at all, because a lot of people say, gazpacho, have you ever heard of that? Anyway.
Arrogant, right. So you're talking about the arrogance, yeah. And think about arrogance in two other ways. One about those who respect and accept science and public health, and think about all those ignorant people who reject it and are calling for in denial about the disease. Or if you want to be further condescending, it's become condescending, although it's also absolutely true that people are talking about their own freedom. I'm thinking of the people most recently at the Ambassador Bridge, the Freedom Convoy, talking about their own freedom. And it's pointed out by people who are more intelligent and sophisticated that that's a freedom without responsibility for other people. Now, that is true. That's a legitimate argument to be made on the one hand. On the other hand, it's presented with a tremendous arrogance about the ignorant versus those who are not ignorant. So that's, as we get deeper and deeper into the Trump years, which are continuing, we have to realize that it's not simply that there's some people who are stupid and some people who are not, but we have to look at why large numbers of people, 35% of the population at least, are making certain choices to not hear science, public health, the rational norms that we're tuned into hearing. And I want to say they make choices to not hear. Now, it's funny, I'm talking about Camus and mentioned his little moment of interaction with Sartre. And a Sartrean notion here would be to say people choose a certain path under great pressure. And we'd have to not simply dismiss them as ignorant or stupid, but ask, why have they chosen that path? That does not mean that you don't oppose the path, but it means the attitude that's taken is, the attitude we have to take is really important. There's a sense on the part of a large part of the population in this country of being talked down to, of grievance, of resentment, and it's something that we ignore at our peril. We have to try to understand it, and there are writers trying to help us understand it. Michael Sandel's book, for example, about merit, the tyranny of merit, helps understand why people choose in a certain direction in a society that's been transformed by the notion of merit over the past generation. Robert Putnam, who was here in this forum a little under a year ago, in his book, The Upswing, which is really about the downswing that we're living through. And Putnam does a great amount of indexing of the various ways in which things have deteriorated. So a sense of community has become a sense of people at odds with each other in the United States. So it's really important to understand where things have gone, I believe, in order to not simply create simple-minded condescension. Now, but that's what's happened. It's interesting, Michael, because our pandemic has met this huge opposition, the understanding of the pandemic, the public health issues about it, and the opposition, as we saw in Canada, as we see in Canada, is not going away so soon. It's getting worse. Yeah. And now I would say one thing, to stick with the theme of the plague, because in the novel, the city is cordoned off. People can't leave. And they begin protesting at the gates. And there are even gunshots heard. Not clear who's shooting. Maybe the guards are shooting at people who are trying to storm the gates. But people are sick and tired of the shutdown, of the lockdown. And I quoted, they call for fresh air and bread. Food supplies are running short, and people are feeling claustrophobic, and they want to get out of the city. And that Camus understood that and wrote about it, 70 years ago. And it's not just an American phenomenon anymore. It's Canadian, but it's also German. It's happening in France. And there's a sense of people getting sick of being watched, being cooped up, being controlled, being monitored. So there's something real happening there as well. And it's, the fact is, masks are coming off all over now. That's like by popular demand.
Thank you.
I see Rose's hand is up.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Let me say first that it is so thrilling to be in this mix today and to see you, Walter. Haven't seen you for a while, certainly not in person, and to see others on this call whom I know well from Wayne State, and to have our beloved interdisciplinary studies program department well represented. And to hear you, Ron, give us a really remarkable insight into both Camus and the pandemic. So I have perhaps a weird out-of-the-box question. How do you think that Camus would finish our story, given what you know about him, and given what you know about what we're experiencing in this country?
It's a terrific question and a horrible one at the same time, projecting
I know.
into, yeah.
I know,
Because-
but we're good friends, so I thought I could do
Good
that.
friends. No, you give me the hardest question. Well, as I mentioned, look, the Plague is I consider it a great novel. It's a marvelous novel. It's wonderfully written and it's powerful, and it has this one problem that the Moroccan and Danish scholars pointed out. It's the one problem, which is it's about, and its solidarity is about, Europeans in Algeria, and it ignores the population, and they then set about in their minds rewriting it, which is unthinkable. You can't, which it transforms the novel, it transforms Camus. Camus was among the best of the French Algerians, and including some of his very courageous efforts during the worst part of the war to head off what became an endless cycle of terrorism. On the one hand, I speak with great admiration for all of that. On the other hand, the fact that he could write only about European Algerians says something about his limits. And it's very important that we accept the greatness and the profound limits, because his culture, his society in which he was born, in which he lived, doesn't exist anymore. And the reason it doesn't exist anymore is because it was unable to comprehend the need for allowing other people in, not just in a controlled way, which is his best visions were, how can we keep it somewhat controlled and give them somewhat of a home rule, but keep France controlling it. But somehow to create a society in which everybody was recognized as legitimate and as members of the, he couldn't do that. He couldn't get that far. And what I want to switch now, and it's painful to realize his great spirit of solidarity had a limited solidarity. But now, as soon as I get there, towards the end of this talk, I'm thinking of, I'll do a class for SOAR in a couple months on whatever happened to All in It Together. Because that, to me, that's the obsessing question. We're all in it together. Well, yes, but no. How did it die? How did it die? What did that mean? And how is it, what are the limits on American society that enable us to really experience all in it together and get beyond what is in fact getting worse and worse and worse? And there's our inability to think as a society. Now, many of us as individuals try to think beyond, but as a society, we seem incapable of really biting into and dealing with the systemic racism, which I think is the core issue. And unable to dig into and free ourselves from the individual freedom model, which is another core issue and connected with the racism. So we've got this fundamental problem, and we're not only not where Camus was, but we're worse off, and that's so troubling. And how do we think ourselves out of it? What politics can take us out of it, which is the most important issue. And when I see Camus' fate, and I see where his Algeria wound up 2 years after he died, I see no solution, no usable direction there. His pronouncements on Algeria and how to solve the Algerian War, no usable pronouncements there. And he doesn't give us any wisdom, I think, for what we need to do. And I think we're in a terrible position right now. And as I say, I think it's getting worse. It's not getting better. That's what's especially frightening. It's not a good answer. Not a cheerful.
I think I see George Benjamin, Jacqueline.
Yeah, just a comment. The issue of mistaking Gestapo and Gazpacho are concerning in the sense that maybe a number of current generations don't know what Gestapo means, which then leads to the issue of attempts to curtail what is taught to our elementary and high school children in terms of history. We have a son-in-law who's a history teacher and very concerned about that issue, as we all are. Just a comment that the other way around is that perhaps she really doesn't know, I'm sure she does, but didn't have the experience of learning somewhere along the way about the Gestapo.
Right. Yeah, well, that, Joyce, that puts us into the question of, which is happening more and more, is one of the problems, limiting what people can teach about our past and our society and our history. State legislatures hysterically passing thought control legislation. All I can say is it needs to be fought against with all our might, obviously. Yeah, obviously.
But again, that just feeds into people seeing one portion of the society seeing the other side as condescending, or we know more than you do.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, I've only lately started to think about what if, for all the things that I fundamentally disagree with that are out there that are going on, what if instead of concluding that you can't talk to these people, I tried to figure out what argument would I make and how do you make those arguments, which ends the condescension, I think, and it propels me and us into doing a much more direct battle with those ideas, even if most people won't listen. I recall experiences of standing in front of an audience that was hostile to what I was presenting and realizing that the best I could do was if I could find someone who would listen to me take a reasonable position. And if I could find one or two people, at least I could make that contact. And I think we have to, I think that side has to be defeated politically, one, and two, has to be argued against and reasoned with in any way possible. because otherwise the ones who are talking about and fearing civil war are presenting us with some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Not that we're talking about civil war, but we're talking about ever worse conflict. And I think we have to figure out what's the alternative. I think politically defeating the Republicans is crucial to that, by the way. Politically defeating them, yes.
Okay. If there weren't any more questions or comments, Rosalind, yes, there will be a recording. I will forward it to Dr. Aronson as soon as it's uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And I can even personally forward it to you if you would like to put your email in the chat. Were there any other questions or comments? I'm assuming not.
Is there any in the chat?
Oh, I looked at, yeah, there's nothing in the chat. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for the attendance today, and thank you, Dr. Aronson, for giving that very valuable talk. I'm so glad that you all got to reconnect again with the Interdisciplinary Studies Department. And so with that being said, the Humanities Center wanted to thank you, Dr. Aronson, by gifting you with a caddy, of like a pen caddy of some sort with our logo on it, and very fitting, a mask with our logo on it as well. Once again, I would like to reiterate that this talk was recorded and will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and you will soon be able to find it on our website, as well as other talks that we've had throughout the semester. Dr. Edwards, was there anything else you wanted to say?
No, just to thank Ron for his wonderful talk. It was good to see him and to reminisce about our times together professionally. I see that Alina Cherry was here. She's since left, but she was one of the resident scholars that you mentored during the time you were here, and she has gone on to become an associate professor and knocking on the doors of full professorship. So thank you for all you've done for the center over the years.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye all.